Welcome to the lecture on Elements of Journalism. Today we're going to be talking about the role that journalism plays within our society and within the world that we live in. Now, you may be asking yourself, why do we need to learn about the elements of journalism in photojournalism? The last couple years I've taught this class, I've realized that when it comes to teaching photojournalism, a lot of students were struggling with the idea of exactly what photojournalism is. So before we can really study photojournalism, I want to teach you guys what journalism is at its core and how that translates later into photography. So let's take a look at a couple things today. First off, understanding the elements of journalism is really important because a lot of people don't understand exactly how journalism works and what role it plays in our society. And because of that, as we can see in this slide right here, the confidence level in the American media by consumers in the United States has fallen quite a bit over the last, roughly about 15 years or so, since 1998. And so we can see in 1998, 53% of people that were polled by the Gallup poll organization had said that they had confidence in mass media such as newspapers, TV, and radio. And we can see that that number dropped to 40% in 2012. So as you can see over on the right side, 60% of media consumers in the United States do not have very much or no confidence whatsoever in the American media. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people just don't simply understand it. All right? So let's go through these elements a little bit one at a time. The first element of journalism is its primary purpose, and that is journalism is to provide its citizens with the information they need to be free and self-governing. You cannot have a free and self-governing society like we do in a democracy without the free flow of information, and journalism is there to provide that. It does that a couple ways. First off, the news media helps us to define our community. It helps us to create a common knowledge and language rooted in reality, meaning rooted in the truth. The truth in that information is what helps us to define our community. It also helps a community to identify a couple of things. It helps to identify its goals. It can do that through building projects, road safety projects, laws that are being implemented to help protect its citizens or to give its citizens freedom. It also helps to identify the heroes of that community. Usually these are people like police officers or firefighters, but it also could be an average person that maybe pulled someone out of a fire or helped a elderly person during a robbery or something like that. And then, of course, we have our villains. And those are the people we see on TV that are, criminals, robbers, things like that as well, too. All right? In the First Amendment, we obviously have the language of the freedom of the press. But what the real meaning of the First Amendment means and what the freedom of the press means is that journalism must be an independent institution. That means that in a free society, in a democracy, the media cannot be controlled by the government. For example, this is a newspaper out of North Korea. Any information on North Korean media, whether it is online, whether it's a newspaper, whether it's a magazine, whether it's a radio broadcast, whether it's a television broadcast, is 100% controlled by the government. That is not information, that is propaganda. There is nothing put in North Korean media that is not approved by the government, and that's something that we here in the United States don't have to deal with. We know that the information that comes to us in the media, at the very least, should be truthful and informative. Speaking of truthful and informative, our first obligation as journalists is to the truth. Our primary duty is to get the facts right. The reason why is because news is the material that people use to learn and think about the world outside of their own doors, outside of their own community. The news is where people learn about the world around them that they don't see every day. Places like exactly what's going on in Syria and its civil war right now, what's taking place in Egypt, events that are taking place in Europe or Asia. We don't live in Europe or Asia. We don't see those things every day. So we rely on the news to give us that information. Because of that, the information has to be usable and reliable. In order for the truth to prevail, journalists must make clear to whom they own their loyalty to. We have an obligation to only a certain group of people, and we owe our first loyalty to those people. And that would be, our loyalty has to be to the citizens of our community and the citizens of our society as well too. This gave birth to a phrase. It's called journalistic independence. Now, what does journalistic independence mean? This means that, for example, if you are looking at an article online, or if you're reading an article in a newspaper or a magazine, let's say it's a restaurant review. Let's say it's a restaurant review over a local barbecue joint here in Kansas City. And I'm going to use Jack Stack. Jack Stack is awesome. I love it. If you guys haven't been to it, I would highly recommend it. That is my review on Jack Stack. But if you were to read a review about Jack Stack in the Kansas City Star, as the consumer, you need to know that that review was not influenced in any way by the fact that maybe Jack Stack has a restaurant ad in the paper, online, or in their broadcast a couple pages down, a couple minutes later, or something like that. Consumers need to know that we're not being influenced in order to get a certain message out there. Again, that goes dangerously close to propaganda. Because of this, we have to maintain ethical guidelines by not accepting gifts, etc., by those people that we cover, because technically that would be a bribe. Now, here's an example. This is an article that was in the Eat and Drink section of the Kansas City Star back in 2009. And you can see, where's Kansas City's best barbecue? Fans aren't reluctant to voice their opinions. Basically meaning that everyone in this town loves barbecue, and everybody has a favorite place they love to go to, and they love to talk about it. So this would be an example of that article that I was just talking about, where let's say if there's an ad for Oklahoma Joe's somewhere else on the website, consumers need to know that this article is not biased, meaning that it shows both sides of an issue, and it's not just going to stick to one side simply because that restaurant bought an ad somewhere else, okay? Journalism, and the essence of journalism, is a discipline of verification. What we need to do is we need to verify information that we're given. And if there's one thing that I really want my students to take away from my classes, is I really encourage them to question everything they've learned. That's not to say that I don't want you to believe in certain things. It doesn't mean that I want you to think or believe in a certain way. But you need to verify the information that you're given in order to help form opinions and beliefs. Let me give you an example, and I hope this doesn't get me in too much trouble, all right? All your life, your parents or grandparents, or you've had someone in your life that has told you, hey, we love you, or I love you. Let me ask you two questions. Number one, how do you know that they love you? And number two, not to freak you out, but how do you even know that they're your parents? Now, don't go running home tonight freaking out saying, oh my God, Mr. Lewis says you don't love me. Oh my God, Mr. Lewis says you're not my parents. That's not the point here, but really stop and think about it. I mean, how do you know that your parents love you? Just because they say so, well, that's coming from one source, and that's your parents, all right? But if you talk to a family friend and that family friend says, I've known your parents for years and I can confirm they love you wholeheartedly. Now you have evidence from someone else that says, hey, your parents do love you, or someone in particular loves you. It could not just be your parents, it could be grandparents or someone else. And now you have verified that, okay? This means that journalism is a focused craft on getting what happened down as correctly as possible, and we have to verify that information through more than one source. Photographs are exactly the same. The information that we need in photographs to give those photographs context into the news, we need to verify that information. In order to do that, a journalist really is someone who can step away from the table and can see the entire picture. They can see everything. They take a look at everything, and that's really what that means, okay? Also, we have to maintain an independence from those people that we cover and those things that we cover as well, too. There's a phrase that you've probably heard of before. It's called a conflict of interest. In the journalism world, this is when a journalist covers a story about an event a place, a person, etc., in which they are personally involved. Let me give you an example. If a journalist goes to cover a bank robbery, and it turns out that one of the hostages in the bank robbery happens to be that journalist's spouse, their husband or their wife, they won't be able to cover that event unbiasedly. They're going to have an opinion because someone they loved was in danger. So they would have to step away from that story and say, someone else needs to cover this. I can't, because it's simply a conflict of interest, okay? And this independence is actually even more important when you consider the following. One of the most important aspects of journalists is that we serve as an independent monitor of power. And it's happened before. The most famous one is the Watergate scandal of 1972. This is where a group of men broke into the Democratic National Committee headquarters in Washington, D.C. The Washington Post sent two reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, to cover the break-in. Well, as Woodward and Bernstein got deeper and deeper into the story, and they talked to more and more sources, they kept digging, and finally it led to the fact that not only did President Nixon know about the break-in, President Nixon may have very well ordered the break-in in order to gain an advantage into the 1972 presidential election. That ended up forcing President Nixon to resign, and I'll show you the front page of the Washington Post here in just 1 second, all right? But it's not just the government, it's not just the president. It extends to all powerful institutions in society. What happens if there is corruption within a police department in a city? Journalists would need to expose that. What if there was an underground, kind of drug trafficking being done through City Hall in a city? Journalists should be able to point that out and let their community know what is going on under their nose. It also means that journalism gives voice to the voiceless. We give those people that cannot speak for themselves an opportunity to give them a voice. Here's an example. This is the Washington Post headline from Friday, August 9th, 1974, where President Nixon resigned, and then Vice President Ford assumed the presidency at that point. But this is a good example of the Watergate and the investigation, which lasted a couple years, actually. It wasn't just one article. It was a series of articles over a couple years that eventually brought a president down. And that really gave birth to what we call investigative journalism, and has made investigative journalism very popular. Okay? Now, journalism works both ways. We must provide a forum for public criticism and comment. We serve as a public forum. That means we are a place for the sharing of information, ideas, and the debate of those ideas as well, too. Now, this comes in different forms. It can be letters to the editor. It can be phone forums where people can call in and leave a voicemail, and then their voicemail is transcribed. It can be a guest columnist, someone who does not work for the paper that writes an opinion piece that is published by the paper. The other area that is a public forum that is open for public criticism and comment is online. If you go to any news website, go to the Kansas City Star at kansascity.com, pull up any article and scroll down to the bottom, you will see comments left by readers there. Now, there's a little bit of debate right now over if that should be allowed, because we do have people called internet trolls who will not even read the articles. They'll go down and they will just make a comment hoping to stir the pot and get people angry. But you know what? I honestly believe that even though internet trolls can be a little disruptive, it's still, that comment section of online news is still important for, again, the sharing of information, ideas, and also the debate of those ideas as well, too. Okay? So this forum must adhere to all other principles and relate to the role journalism plays in a democracy. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people are pointing out the internet trolls, saying they're not really following the principles. It's not really relating to the role in journalism in a democratic society. I mean, you can kind of go either way with that, okay? So here's an example. In the Kansas City Star every day, they have letters to the editor, which you can kind of see down here in the lower right-hand corner on their opinion page. Now, I don't have a full letter up there for someone to read, but this is where readers of the Kansas City Star can send an email or a written letter to the editor-in-chief of the Kansas City Star, and a majority of the time it will be published. This is an opportunity for people to sound off on an article that was in the Kansas City Star. They can sound off on a grievance about something taking place within Kansas City itself. It's a place where a lot of people talk about political issues, national, local, etc. Two of the headlines you can see here, there's one for better bus safety. Lately in the news, there have been some unfortunate accidents on buses. A school bus overturned last week. There have also been a bus driver was beat up over the summer in a little bit more of an inner city section of Kansas City. And there was also a shooting as well, too, in a bus where one person was shot in the hand. They were not critically injured, but that's brought up, the fact that maybe we need some better bus safety. Down in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see Johnson County KCI. There's a big debate right now whether or not the Kansas City International Airport should be turned from its current 3-terminal kind of half-moon things that you got going on. You've been up to the airport before. Well, most of you have been up to the airport before. I'm sorry, I don't mean to assume. And what the plan is to put it into one big terminal. Well, not everybody's on board with that. So what this person is saying is, hey, why don't we just move the Kansas City International Airport down into Johnson County, Kansas, where there's quite a bit of people and population and things like that as well too. Again, maybe just stirring the pot, but this is where an open forum comes into place because this is where people can voice their opinion. By the way, side note, I always ask my students this. I'll just go ahead and say it. When I open up a newspaper, the very first section I go to, it's not the sports, it's not the news. It's the opinion section because I like to read people's opinions, especially the letters to the editor, because I like to see what non-journalists are thinking, what their opinions are, and things like that as well too. All right. So the other thing that we have to do as journalists is we have to make the significant relevant and also interesting. There's a saying that I have in my publication staffs. I always tell my yearbook, my newspaper staffs this. There's no such thing as a boring story. There are only boring reporters. There are plenty of times where maybe there's a news story over something at the school and I'll have a student journalist say, God, this is so boring. No one's going to read this. Well, then make it not boring. That's our job. Journalists, we're storytellers, but we're storytellers with a purpose. We don't make facts up. We relay the facts, but we have to do it in a more interesting way. One of the key ways that we do that is by focusing on the people involved in the story and the people that were impacted by the story rather than just the story itself. Journalists should also keep the news in proportion and also make it comprehensive. And what I mean by that is this. A front page story that is fun and interesting may be there, but by no reasonable definition contains anything significant, can be a distortion. All right, so if you have a front page story and, this is fun and interesting, but there's really nothing there significant for the reader, that means it's a distortion for the reader. This is what consumers should ask when they are looking at the front page of any local media page or even national media page. There's 3 things we need to look at. Number 1, can we see the whole community in the coverage? Or is it just part of the community? All right. If it only affects a small portion of the community, what is it doing on the front page? That might be a little bit of a distortion. Okay. Do I see myself in this story? Am I directly impacted by this story? What does this story mean to me? And by the way, guys, I would say this, as teenagers, you may not see the impact of the news that's taking place today, but I guarantee you it does impact you. It impacts the future. You guys are the future. You guys are the ones that are going to be living in the future. So make sure you're paying attention to the news. Make sure you're paying attention to the things that are going on around the world as well, too. And then the third thing is, does the report include a fair mix of what most people would consider either interesting or significant? Meaning that if a majority of people were to look at this and say, I don't really see the meaning or the fact that it's interesting or even significant at all, might be a little bit of a distortion. All right. So, for example, this is the front page of the Kansas City Star. This was just the other day, actually. So there's 2 stories on here that I just wanted to highlight. First off, there's a new hotel planned in the Crossroads section, which is just south of downtown. And if you look at the subheadline, it says a Tennessee-based developer will not seek public incentives for the 257-room project, which means that they're not going to look at raising taxes in order to pay for it. So a new hotel means a couple things. Any type of new construction means it's going to cost something to build. So that might be a negative thing. A positive thing is that whenever we build something new, it creates jobs. It creates construction jobs. It creates jobs within that hotel. And also its location in the Crossroads area, where it's close to downtown, and there's plenty that goes on down the Crossroads area. It's a very artsy and craftsy type of district. There are plenty of restaurants down in that area as well, too. It's a very nice area. And, of course, putting a hotel down there would help people kind of stay and mingle around as well, too, right? So that's the one story I can point out. The one over there on Wall Street, since it's a financial market and a lot of people are affected by the financial market, maybe not so much you guys right now, but that's a reason why that story is on the front page, all right? We have to have a obligation to a personal conscience. That means that we are allowed to be affected by the news that we cover too. We have to have some sort of, kind of moral compass that helps us, and we do that through having a sense of personal ethics and responsibility. Now, we're going to go over journalism law, and we're going to go over journalism ethics later on in the semester, but I just wanted to point this out to you now so you can see this. And then finally, the last thing here is journalists have to recognize a personal obligation to sometimes disagree with editors, with owners of their newspaper, with advertisers, and even citizens sometimes. It's perfectly okay for journalists to have an opinion. However, when our opinion starts to get into our news coverage, that's where things can kind of get a little bit dangerous and can go back to the fact that, again, the American citizens are not wholeheartedly confident in the media at this point. All right? So there you go, guys. Those are the elements of journalism which help us to define journalism in a free and democratic society, and also helps define exactly what journalism is as well, too. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know. Thanks for listening, guys.